Second hour of the program. It is the Thursday. Bold Republic is on the radio, and because it's a Thursday, that means we head on down to Cheyenne. And Steve Klein from Wyoming Liberty Group joins us. This is the guy who can hold his breath underwater for a whole 4 minutes and 27 seconds. And you're going to update us, I guess, on some campaign finance rules that are out there. If I remember the conversation that we had, wasn't this over just a little while ago, a Supreme Court decision, Steve, that led to Wyoming to have to change some of its rules like you're about to talk to us about?
That's right, Glenn. A few months ago, the United States Supreme Court overturned a federal law that prohibited or limited what are called aggregate contribution limits. Basically, under federal law, you have limits on how much money a person can give to a candidate, but then also this overall limit. And a guy named Sean McCutcheon went all the way to the United States Supreme Court and challenged that, and it was overturned, the aggregate ban. There's still individual contribution limits, but there's no longer an aggregate ban under federal law. What's interesting is here in Wyoming, under our state law, we have an individual contribution limit of $1,000 per candidate, and we also have an aggregate contribution limit of $25,000. So even though there are 75 legislative seats up for grabs this year, as well as, and not all of them are contested, but there are at least possible 75 legislative elections, and then 5 statewide offices up for election as well, the contribution limit overall is still only $25,000 under Wyoming law, and that's just as unconstitutional as it was under federal law. So basically, up in the Corporations, Elections, and Political Subdivisions Committee met last week up in Sheridan, and I headed up there to testify for 2 days on 2 different election law matters, one of which was the fallout of this McCutcheon decision. To its credit, the Corporations Committee recognizes this unconstitutional problem, has asked the Attorney General to write an official statement on where he stands on the status of our law now, and it went over quite well. It's interesting, and I think that the broader, more positive note that came out of this meeting is that our Corporations and Elections Committee, this is a citizen legislature. We have that run as citizens to hold legislative offices, and they understand the follies of so-called campaign finance reform, which is something we've worked on since our beginnings here at Wyoming Liberty Group back in 2008. And that's basically that you make a law that is so complex that a candidate has to hire accountants, attorneys, and campaign experts just to comply with the law, and then they have to focus so much on fundraising and other things that they get lost and lose a lot of time that they would have spent engaging with constituents and otherwise running for office. And that's for a citizen legislature, that is a very understandable concept. And I think that was really the most positive thing to take away from that meeting. And I can't say that it really could not have gone better, and that's really great news. And that applies not just to this aggregate contribution limit, because we talk a mean game. A lot of so-called reformers want to try and get money out of politics, but they've never quite figured out exactly how you can engage, take out advertisements, make lawn signs, and even just put gas in your tank to go around your district and talk to people without money. And the way with these aggregate contribution limits that we have under the law, it wasn't really this. My worry is not, there's a rich person out there donating. My worry out there is that there's 75 offices up for grabs, and so many candidates get left out and can't get any money to run their campaigns because they can't access the people who can afford to give a lot of money. So there's really 2 different ways to look at it, and I think that's really important, especially here in Wyoming, where $1,000 can make all the difference in a small campaign.
Well, and as you're saying this right away, it brings to mind for me that that would mean that a lot of smaller candidates who would be very good public servants would just not even bother to run, because the campaign finance laws, once they get a look at it, there's no reason for them to even step into the race. It would be unrealistic.
Right, and the good news is, Wyoming's campaign laws are not perfect, but compared to so many other states, we're doing a lot better. And that's the reason we do a national outreach in our free speech efforts. We go to different states and, of course, the federal level as well, because we fear that a bad idea can spread very quickly, and that's kind of the story of the last 30 years of campaign finance law. Last week, before I went up to that meeting, we filed a friend of the court brief in Texas in the case of Tom DeLay, and that's a persecution that is now over a decade old. This guy has been fighting criminal charges for engaging in a political campaign for the better part of a decade. And it's really, it's embarrassing, and it's tragic, and it's actually quite disgusting what's been going on. That this guy got together with some people, they figured out how to comply with Texas election law by getting a lot of money together and getting it to candidates, and who ran some very successful campaigns. And a very bitter prosecutor decided to put the election law and the money laundering statute together in a blender and invent some whole new way of prosecuting someone. It's shameful that the case has gone on this long. Now it's at the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, the highest criminal court in Texas. If DeLay's conviction has already been overturned at a lower court, a lower appellate court, and if it's somehow reinstated, we're certainly going to take this case to the United States Supreme Court, because this is nothing more than the criminalization of politics. And that's far dirtier than any of the dirtiest things, and certainly Tom DeLay's a pretty notorious character for many other reasons. But the fact is, it's far worse for prosecutors to invent laws and prosecute people for crimes that they've made up, especially when those crimes relate to one of our first freedoms, the freedom of speech, the freedom to engage in the political process.
Well, and I'm talking to Steve Klein from Wyoming Liberty Group about some campaign finance reform. So, okay, let's take people through the process in a state like Wyoming. If I just, as an average Joe citizen, wanted to get together with some average Joe citizens and raise some money and support a candidate, are there rules in place now that I would have to comply with, or could I just go ahead and raise some money and buy some advertising for the guy with or without his permission?
You'd still have to, and this is not legal advice, but you have to go ahead and check out the Secretary of State's office. They have a website. You have to register a political committee. I've done this on my own in my personal life, not through Wyoming Liberty. And it's a very simple process. And again, to the Secretary of State's credit, they offer courses. They're going to be going around the state offering courses this month, helping people to comply. I think it's a fairly simple and straightforward process. The really good news is that if you make a mistake, that the idea is they're there to help you to rectify the situation. They're not there to wait for you to screw up and to punish you. And frankly, that's the entire MO of the Federal Election Commission. They wait for you to screw up, and then they fine you. And especially if you're a grassroots campaign, you would then have to hire yourself a DC attorney and go before this agency you may never have heard of and basically negotiate the lowest fine you can get before you can go back and actually run your campaign. So it's a whole different attitude within our state election system in the enforcement process that I think really helps. And I think, again, I think the rules are fairly self-explanatory. Most candidates don't really have a problem in trusting their brother-in-law or neighbor to be their campaign treasurer. And it's very, it's really straightforward. Again, it's not perfect. I would like, as you just said, Glenn, I think it wouldn't be a corrupting thing for you to be able to just simply get together with friends, trust one another, take out some advertisements. I think that's exactly how it should be. But again, from a perspective of how bad it is in some other states, Texas, Maine, Wisconsin, Washington State, given how bad it's getting there, we are in a very good position.
All right, talking with Steve Klein from Wyoming Liberty Group about campaign finance reform. In fact, one of the things you just said, though, I've been complaining about for a while, and I'm not trying to change topics, but it's kind of like the EPA showing up at Andy Johnson's property here in Wyoming over that pond. They didn't show up and say, here, we're here to help you. Let's show you how to put you into compliance. Instead, they showed up and came down with a hammer. So it's encouraging to me that, okay, these people will now, over at the Secretary's office, show us the process and help us through the process so we are in compliance. So what if I'm just a stinking rich guy, not even just in the state of Wyoming? What about a stinking rich guy from outside of the state of Wyoming that wants to have some influence?
Well, the First Amendment is a national, under our United States Constitution, applies to everyone, and not just under state law, but under federal law. And this was an area that I testified as far as ballot petitions go. That was another area of Wyoming law that does need some reforms, because as you may know, it's very difficult, and we saw this with Senate File 104. That was a referendum that a few citizens tried to get on the ballot so people could vote on it. Now, SF 104 was overturned by the Wyoming Supreme Court, but before that, during this referendum process, it became very cumbersome. And you have a very limited time period within which to get all these signatures. You have to get a certain percentage of signatures from every single county in Wyoming. So it's a very difficult process. That's an area that's worth discussing, but from the free speech angle, we have some laws that are plainly unconstitutional as to how you can go about getting these signatures. You, for example, have to be a Wyoming resident if you want to go gather signatures. That's unconstitutional. You can come into this state and you can lobby, you can go collect signatures, and again, you don't have to like that, but their free speech rights are no different from yours. Then there's also the ability to pay people to go and get signatures. We have a prohibition under our law that prohibits paying per signature. Now, if you want to do this, there are professional signature gatherers who go to a lot of different states and do this kind of thing. And given the short time frame within which we have to collect the necessary signatures, it's almost essential. So looking to overturn those two things in our law, to amend the laws to allow for that, will really help overcome the burdens of getting stuff on the ballot. But as you mentioned, you discussed other, rich people coming in and spending on your own. If you have a lot of money, you can do a heck of a lot of things without even worrying about filling out forms. And that's, I think, goes to the problems with contribution limits. And here we're seeing it right now in the Wyoming Secretary of State race. No need to mention names, but we have an apparently well-funded, self-funded candidate who can go out there and buy really nice signs. We have TV spots going up now, and that's a very interesting amount of money. He has the money already; he doesn't even have to go raise it. But then you have people who are limited to raising $1,000 from people who could potentially contribute $10, $20, $50,000 to their campaign, but they can't do it because we have these contribution limits. So that's very interesting because it's not actually the money of the self-funded candidate that's shutting people out. It's the law that's shutting people out. So you have to really take a nuanced view and look at all the different, perhaps unintended consequences in the law.
Steve, if there's anything that you could change, because you said you were very encouraged about the meetings that you've been having, but is there anything in there that you would like to see them change that maybe they're not going to?
Well, if last year's budget session or this year's budget session was any sign, there was a bipartisan bill brought by Senator Cale Case and Representative Jim Byrd to modify part of the law that's pretty interesting. That what it basically does is it prohibits independent and third-party candidates from raising money during the primary season, because the law treats the primary and the general election as separate elections, and then it prohibits raising money for the general election until after the primary. So this is kind of cool if you're a Republican or a Democrat, because you can then raise $1,000 maximum for the primary, and then $1,000 if you advance into the general election from the same person. So our limit is actually $2,000 if you're thinking of the election as a whole. But if you're an independent or a third-party candidate, number one, you can't raise money right now. You are prohibited from raising money until the August primary. So let's look at a lot of the races we have going on. For example, again, the Secretary of State race, we have a third-party candidate, and she's restricted from raising money right now. It says it right there in the law. So Senator Case and Representative Byrd brought this bill to say that restriction only applies if you are actually participating in a primary. But that bill only received 8 votes to get introduced, and you'd need about 12 more just for it to be considered during a budget session. So that's a really blatant unconstitutional law that I think really needs a serious amendment. I suspect that you might be hearing more about that here in the coming months, but you don't really know. And again, when you have a law that is that blatantly censorious, I mean, to say that you can't raise a dime for your campaign, even though you're running against 4 different people for the same office, you have serious censorship problems. And so I suspect, given what I've seen under the law, that with that kind of unconstitutionality, it might not even be enforced. But nevertheless, when the law says something, it still instills enough fear in people that they might not speak out at all. So we'll see. We'll see about that change. But otherwise, again, as long as the law is stable, predictable, and understandable by the average person, I think that's a very good thing. I wish it was that way for all laws. Unfortunately, it's only when you have, say, a direct relation to a constitutional right do the courts really up and pay attention. So I wish there was something I could do about the Internal Revenue Code, or as you've mentioned many times, the Environmental Protection Act, with a definition that seems to change every 10 minutes when someone at the EPA gets an idea. So eventually, hopefully, the doctrines of vagueness and overbreadth mean something for all law, but for now it's really isolated to constitutional rights like free speech and like criminal law, Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment issues.
Is there, I've always been confused by this, any reason that they can cough up for why, if I'm going to run for office, that I can't just raise money anytime I want? I mean, if I decide I'm going to run for an office that's not open until 2 years from now, why can't I start raising money now?
You know, it's an interesting question. I can't give you the law right off the top of my head, but it seems that every election cycle, you can certainly carry over. I imagine you'd be prohibited from raising for 2 years from now, but I think immediately after the general election, you could raise money for the following primary, assuming you were running as a major party candidate, Democrat or Republican. It really gets dicey when you're running independently or running as a third party candidate. So, but they want to keep those isolated. And that's another problem that, again, if you're independent third party, you're already going up against war chests of incumbents. And again, in Wyoming, a war chest for a House district, 15,000, for a Senate district, maybe 20,000, and you have a pretty sizable chunk of change comparatively. So there's the problem. I think this is a mistake in drafting. I think it's unfortunate. We talk a lot about, oh man, we have two parties and they're just, some people would say they're too similar. But it's certainly, sometimes it's not just culture, but it's actually the law that's helping those parties stay in power. And this is one of those.
Does this, we have about 2 minutes left, does this also affect just in general? I talked earlier about me getting together with some people and raising money to support a candidate with or without his approval. But what if I just wanted to organize a community action group of some kind for whatever kind of campaign? Does this affect me? No one's running for office. We're just forming like a Tea Party group. Does this fall into this kind of campaign finance reform?
No, it doesn't. Basically, a political committee, you have to be engaging in express advocacy. You have to be actually engaging in taking out ads or speech that is saying, hey, vote for this person or vote against this person. And again, that was what our free speech lawsuit against the Federal Election Commission was all about, is that they think anytime you criticize a candidate for something, that falls under their purview. And unfortunately, we lost that case, but I think the issue is still percolating at the state level and is going to continue to go there. But in the meantime, for the purposes of Wyoming law, I'm pretty sure that getting together and engaging in political issue advocacy is generally largely unregulated and hopefully will stay that way.
All right, Steve Klein, Wyoming Liberty Group, and of course they can go ahead and find your article. Where at online?
wyliberty.org. Check us out anytime.
All right, Steve, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Glenn.